Yeah, food design.
I just put on my teacher voice.
Yeah.
I got a really good teacher voice. I used to have an auditorium twice the size of this. You'll do that. Yeah, you don't need to do that ever.
It's and then it's a small house on that says the F floor.
Yeah, it is.
Everybody, thank you for coming to recording and sharing heritage stories. My name is Holly Zane. I'm the Associate Director for Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. How many here know what a National Heritage Area is? Most of the room, thank you. We are one of 55 in the United States, and our mission is basically to tell the stories that have national significance. And for us, that means the border war, Civil War, the settlement of the Western frontier, but our overriding one is the enduring struggle for freedom, which seems to overlap all of those other stories. Today we have, 3.5 presenters, panelists. First of all is Elisa Palmer Branham. She's a native Kansan and graduate of KU, and with her late husband Richard, she taught genealogy classes at Watkins Museum of History for several years. And she recently retired from KU and has started to write her own family history and focusing first on her grandmothers. Also here is Alex Kimball-Williams, and she is a multicultural activist, artivist, which is artist and activist. Her focuses of her work is on ethnopolitics, medical activism, natural sciences, and she co-founded the Sanctuary Alliance in Black Lawrence, and Black stands for Black Literature and Arts Collective of Kansas. She also performs indigenous dance music under the name of Bad Alaskan and has worked on several creative projects exploring local narratives and histories. We also have with us Jensita Warrington, who is from the Menominee Nation on her father's side and Potawatomi and Ho-Chunk nations on her mother's. She has pursued a career in tribal law and policy and cultural preservation management. She is currently the executive director of the Native American Affairs for the state of Kansas. And she owns the consulting company of Indigenous Kwe, which is interesting in that Kwe means hello in my tribal language. In fact, Kwe, Omatero, hello friends. Today how we wanted to start was I was going to ask some questions of each one of the panelists, but then we wanted to turn it over to you all to ask questions. So this will be more of a Q&A forum, let's start with the first question. Maybe something for Lisa. What kind of information needs to be learned to set heritage stories into context?
Well, I think, from my point of view as a genealogist, I look at a lot of history, trying to find the context of a time period and a space. I wanted to say, As a genealogist, I look at the history of a place, history of a time period. Genealogists are frequently looking at their own history from their own individual ancestors. So I think it's important to do that, but also important to look at the community that person is living in, the time period, and the place, and maybe it's place that connects so much with this particular audience of people. I'd like to tell you all, before we get too far going, that I've sent a Introduction to Genealogy handout that I'm providing for the conference. There's some copies of it out front, and it'll be up on the website by about Wednesday or so if you're interested in that. I'm happy to stay afterwards and answer genealogy-related questions that you might have. But, you know, genealogy research, in a way, is a way of making the history of a place, your people, your community, come alive to you as individual people. So I think that's a good way for some people to enter these conversations about place and history.
So, Alex, what can historical sites and museums do to ensure that stories are told authentically and appropriately, accurately, with a balanced perspective?
I think the biggest thing that a lot of institutions can do is look at their budgets. You know, who's on their payroll, who are they inviting, are they compensating them fairly, are they getting their story straight, checking with authentic story holders. That's a really big piece that I think, obvious piece that people don't always think about. There's this really, and this has happened for a long time, this idea of reaching out to people of color to be kind of informants and to kind of check off that, you know, an institution or a group is doing things authentically instead of allowing them to shine through and to bring it actually authentically. So I would say that's the biggest thing, and then making sure that you're engaging those audiences that the stories are about. That may mean going through different outlets. Maybe your institution explores mostly things online, and that might mean switching to more in-person things or vice versa. You know, thinking about that accessibility point of the people affected, whose ancestors that you're talking about, or whose contemporary stories that you're talking about.
So, Jancita, can sharing heritage stories empower others?
Yeah, definitely. I think that sharing those stories can empower not you only as yourself, because along the way, even though we think we know the whole story, as we start researching, the more that we speak to others and engage with others, the more kinds of stories come out, or the more parts of a story that we learn that help connect us to the bigger story. It definitely empowers us and you all as researchers or people working on the project, but it also helps to empower your community, because many of the times these stories are very, very powerful and connect us to a place. And when we don't know the story, or we only know a part of the story, it's interesting, but as we learn more and develop that story, it really starts to resonate within our community. And then we feel ownership of that. We feel connection, empathetic connection to that. And it, in the long term, I feel, makes us care about that more, makes us want to work harder to preserve those stories and make sure that those stories stay alive for the next generation, so that the place is not only powerful but meaningful to us as well. More importantly, along the way, I think that it really helps to empower some families and communities, through various reasons, have lost access to those stories. Sometimes it's they were taken from their communities. Other times they've had devastating things like fires or other things that have destroyed documents that at one time we didn't really realize the power of backing things up. So we only had original copies of things, and once those were lost, we really lost a lot of that history. And as our elders in every community past, they take some of that knowledge along with them. And so it really does help to re-empower families that lie within communities that have some of these powerful stories to share.
Give an example of the Johnson County History Museum. They felt that all of their stories of people of color were hidden because there were not any notes within index cards. If there was a photograph and there happened to be a person of color, their name wasn't on it. So they did an audit of every item within their archives to elevate history that they looked at as being lost because it was not documented, it was not indexed within their collection. You couldn't say, I want to look up the histories that you have for every person of color, and they wouldn't have it within their archives. And so they made an attempt in the last year or two to do that and to present on those areas. Does anybody have any questions right now, too, of the panel? We'll continue down the road of asking some additional questions. So, Lisa, how would a individual uncover and tell their family's heritage stories? Where would one start?
Well, like any kind of research, you start by gathering information, right? Has anybody been working on genealogy that's out in the audience? Just one couple people? Oh, great. Oh, great. Me too. It's an addiction, so brace yourself if you get started. Gathering the information that you know, and then starting to look at sources for other information. But one thing that I think people do is they start gathering information, and they don't stop and pause and think, who's my audience for this story? How do I want to preserve it? What's significant about it? Just maybe to me, but maybe to future generations, maybe to other people. That's part of why I'm sitting down and starting to write the stories of my grandmothers. After 25 years of research, I've realized I had these two very interesting, different, unusual women in my life who had a big influence on me. And they came out of very different backgrounds. And so I've had the time to digest and learn that information. Now I want to preserve that information. Preserving their history is really important to me. So I would say becoming knowledgeable, maybe taking some classes, deciding how much time you have to devote to doing family history, whether you want to do online or paper or both, which is what I do. Whether you're interested in something like DNA, research, etc. There's all kinds of different questions to ask yourself because it's a research project, you know, just like any other research project. So, yeah.
So Alex, what involvement should art and music and dance and language have in telling the heritage stories?
I think that they would obviously have a really big part. I think a lot of times we think about, culture and genealogy, in terms of genealogy and place, and all of these things are very, very important. I'm the family archivist for family pictures and all of that, and kind of understanding copies of census records and where do people come from. But a lot is told in the music and the dance and kind of those aspects of culture, including language, and I think also specifically coming from a Native background, so much of story and culture is lost when you don't tell it in the original language and when you don't respect how it was originally represented. And so much is lost, even just translating stories. So it's a really big piece. And it's also the piece that I think makes it the most accessible for people to hang on to and to learn about, specifically children. So, as you're teaching children kind of about different cultures and things like that, teaching them those things through songs, through dance, getting their bodies moving, these are the kinds of things that children really hold on to. So yeah, really big teaching components to it as well.
I just wanted to add a little bit to that as well as there's ways for people within their family and within their culture to be able to use music and dance to be able to retain those stories and tell those stories and understand those stories. But it's also really important for us to be able to share those stories in a cultural context and through the language and be able to explain those things to our communities and to others that are interested in the research. Obviously, there's a very fine line between something that's ceremonial and something that's cultural, but the things that are cultural are meant to share who we are and tell our story and to explain our identity. And when we're able to do that from outside the culture, it really fosters a greater appreciation within the whole community for the culture that it comes from. Because oftentimes those things are mislabeled or very vaguely represented in public school education. And so we don't gain really as insightful of an understanding of them, therefore we don't appreciate them as much as we can. And so when we learn the stories or we're able to hear them in their authentic form and then really understand like a design or a song or a color palette and what those things mean, in many cultures at a time when the government outlawed these things, it was through the art and through song and dance that the stories were retained and those things continued to be passed on. But today, we don't sometimes share those things, and so when we have maybe a big company like Urban Outfitters or something that culturally appropriates something, they don't realize that an arrow or a teepee upside down or one way or the other, they think it just looks like a cool geometric design, but they really have great meaning to the people. So as we continue to share those things and educate our communities about our culture, again, I just think it fosters this greater appreciation for culture from everybody, from our children to our own understanding to also the communities that we live in, because many times there's a lot of people of every culture that are integrated into very large communities everywhere, and there's just a lot of room for growing on and learning on every single level.
Great points, and for a lot of Native people, language, music, dance are central to their identity. Humor, too, is central to identity, and that's through the stories. You've got represented here Alaskan, Great Lakes, Canadian originally, and a lot of folks believe a stereotypical Native within the TV or movie context, and this gives an individual voice by demonstrating language, music, dance that gives life to the specifics of our tribes, which are so different from the areas that we're currently in. Any questions right now? Oh. Everybody getting their exercise for the day. And who would you like to ask?
On the DNA test kit, what are the better, more successful test kits to use on DNA heritage?
So the question was, what's the best DNA test kit?
We actually taught 2 or 3 different courses in this, so if you're specifically interested in it, if you're specifically interested in that, I'm happy to visit with you about that, and someone can also email me and I'll send you my information packet about what to do. We always recommend Ancestry DNA. They have the largest database. They are very, very skilled at breaking things down. They are getting more and more detailed with the information they provide you afterwards. But what makes DNA really powerful to a genealogist is to use it along with your own records for your family. People tend to do DNA kits for two different reasons. Some people are only interested in your ethnicity, and that's the simple, straightforward thing they want to know. And so for them, they don't need to go on and do all of that extra work. I'll give you an example from myself. I researched my family forever. My grandfather was supposedly, the story's going somewhere, supposedly German, an immigrant, a tailor who came to the country in 1850. I knew everything about his family. I had researched everything about his family. And then I did a DNA and discovered I had no links to anyone in that family. And it started me on this very incredible journey of finding out who my real biological grandfather was. And I was able to find him, just like I have friends who were adopted who found family members. There are some ethical pitfalls in all of that, which again I'm happy to discuss with you afterwards, but if you're just going to start with one, typically we recommend Ancestry. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So Alex, this is a follow-up question on the earlier question is, what is most important for others to understand about your heritage and your heritage stories?
You specifically?
Yeah.
Oh, I would say the history of displacement. It's just so deep. Like, my mother's family's from Europe, and they came here during World War II. So there's some history of displacement there. Obviously, West African slave trade displacement. And being able to do some research into my ancestry, finding out what plantation that they were from, what the master's name was, and what they actually grew crop-wise, and the livestock that they took care of, like all of that was just to kind of hear about what their everyday life was like, what were the conditions likely to be like based on the number of enslaved people on that plantation. All of that was really important to find out. And then, of course, being Native, how did an Alaskan end up here, you ask? Well, boarding schools, things, of course, also related to World War II happened where my tribe lands are at in Alaska on the Aleut Islands. I actually get some type of payout for that once a year from World War II. And I guess they took over a couple of the islands for military reasons. And yeah, just this idea of displacement and reparations. I have a pretty good understanding of what reparational frameworks look like being Native. I went to Haskell Indian Nations. I get a per cap for my tribe, and that's not common. Most tribes do not see any type of monthly or for my tribe quarterly, because we're a corporate tribe, anything like that. So I've seen that, and I've seen getting to go to the health center in Lawrence, and then I've seen, being Black and none of that. But there's other things in place, and so it's just interesting, kind of seeing all these different approaches to what do you do to make up for or to repair actual displacement, and can it ever be repaired? And so yeah, I would say the history of those things probably the most important.
You mentioned boarding schools, and I want to head this question over to Jenzia. That you were the head of the museum at Haskell, and I wondered about what was important about telling the stories of boarding schools, but also within that is asking, how do you tell stories to young people that involve trauma or very difficult history?
Well, the first part of that question, why it was important to tell those stories of boarding schools, because the more that's coming out with some of the government reports that have been released within the last few months from the Department of the Interior and Secretary Hallen's initiative on boarding schools and establishing the truths and some of the just empirical numbers from boarding schools. There's actually never been a study that has been conducted to say exactly how many children were taken to boarding schools. There was federal government-run boarding schools, and then there were the areas within the reservations were, for lack of better terms, shopped out to different denominations of churches who bid on the areas, and once they bid on the areas and paid the government, then they were able to establish their denomination's church within that area, and no other religious denomination could come and set up in that area. And then their denomination was able, or basically gained exclusive rights to convert the people within that area. So not every boarding school that was set up in the United States was government run or government sanctioned. Many of them were private church organizations who ran the schools with very little to no regulations. And so there's a lot of that history that has never been told, that has never been recorded, or some of them have been recorded through various means of the church, but then the church, because it's not a public entity, has able to have retained all of that information within their own archives and doesn't have to release it because it's not a public entity that requires that. So as far as Haskell, though, Haskell was a congressionally funded boarding school. It was regulated by the United States government. It does follow the federal guidelines. All of their information, not all, their information is supposed to be archived within a federal archive. But even then, so little of that information is easily accessible to the average researcher. You gotta know within what finding of what government report and what federal archive to go to even find this information, and then within the archive you got to know which particular volume of reports from which government agency that you need to look in at the time. And so it's possible, but it's just not very easily accessible to the average researcher, so it takes a lot of looking and a lot of digging. But you can find information in those reports. But still, those reports were never given with any inclusiveness from the people of which the reports were written from. They were only written from a very skewed perspective of the government agents at the time, or the government officials or employees that were there to do the job of the government. And so it was their opinions that formed the reports. And so it was just important because a lot of these stories of the history of boarding schools do exist in the tribal communities that these boarding school members came from, and it's all oral history. Some of them, and actually in many cases, they were so traumatized by the things that happened there, many of them would not speak of it when they came back into the communities. And many of them could still speak their languages, but they never passed that on to their children for fear of the physical harm that was caused to them as a result of knowing their language. So there was a great, great loss of language from one generation to the next. And that significantly impacted the way that we tell stories and the way that we retain history, because in our tribal languages, we don't have a lot of words that can convert to English. So we try our best to be able to describe what it is that we're talking about, but through that translation, some of that story gets lost. And so it was just really important to listen to the tribal elders in the communities, or some of the alumni of Haskell that would share their stories with us about particular times and things that went on, and be able to record those stories for the archives. Maybe we weren't going to use them at that particular time, maybe we weren't going to curate an exhibit about that particular subject matter, but again, the likelihood that I would see that elder again within my lifetime was going to probably be very rare, and I realized that. And so I meticulously tried to record as much as I could with their permission, to try to help to start to build a tribal version of the times at Haskell other than what we knew from the government reports. I'm sorry, I forgot for a second. Part of your question. Oh, yeah. So the question was, what's the best way to tell stories of trauma to children? And that was also something that I had to do because we serviced anybody in the public, but also any school-age children that wanted to come through college age. And the best way that I could do that is to try to create a parallel in something of history that was happening at the time, again, on a very broad, from a very broad aspect, not going into very detailed things that happened to the children at the time, but try to create, based on their own experience, something that they knew about in their grade or something that happened in the United States here, and then equate that to something that happened at Haskell. But many of them would look at the pictures and would always ask me, well, where was their mom and dad? How come these kids were here? Like, they're only little kids. And so I would just have to tell them, you know, they got brought here without their parents. And so they were very confused. Well, why did their parents let them come here if they were that little? And I would just tell them, you know, they didn't let them come here. They just had to come here. But, and so their questions kept, I mean, they're very logical questions to a child, thinking like, my mom and dad won't ever let me go barely, you know, down the road by myself, or I can't go anywhere. But I would just try to wrap it up and not really divert their attention, but just say it was a very, very different time back at that time, and we as people and we as the government and we as our leaders made some mistakes that weren't really that good for children at one time, but now, lucky you guys live in a different generation where you have lots of rights and things that protect you as a child, at least here in the United States, because I couldn't even talk about that in general because they could turn on the news, or if their parents watched the news, and you could still see all these atrocities that were happening worldwide to children. And so I tried not to generalize it to everywhere, but just say in the United States here, and you guys have amazing teachers like Mrs. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so that, you know, think about you guys every night when they go home, and they think about how they're going to teach you and what they're going to teach you, and they make these things really fun for you and bring you to places like the Cultural Center so you can learn more than things that are out of books. And I would try to make it something positive for them to be able to appreciate where they were in their lives as opposed to the kids that were there, because their questions started really going into very logical things, and I was very careful as to not want to traumatize them or talk too much about that history, but I just wanted them to have a basic understanding of the history that was there so that they could, and later on in their life, maybe appreciate Haskell for what it would be in the future if they stayed in the community there.
I appreciate you. There is quite a bit of holes in federal records. If you're trying to tell the story of folks that were affected by the federal government, I've been involved with the Cobell case, trying to find records for over $100 billion worth of lost funds, or when I was on a lawsuit to protect a cemetery in Kansas City that was being desiccated, I asked for the Secretary of Interior's file on this particular land, and what I got was every other tribe's but my own's history, which means all those other tribes don't have access to their documents. The federal government has a very poor system for indexing, for collecting, for keeping some of the COBOL records that were found in outhouses stacked out in South Dakota. Trying to rebuild that history for us that have a long history with the federal government through a trust relationship has been very difficult. So, Alex, can I ask you a question about what would you recommend to historic sites or museums to help them reach out to communities of color so that as they're telling stories of the community, that the perspective of people of color are also taken into account in their perspectives.
Yeah, I think I'm always really, I always really admire when institutions have that self-awareness, and that, I've worked in museums, and I've worked with museums and public schools and all of that. And I always really admire when they want to do that, when they want to allocate their time, usually staff time, to do that, leverage connections that they've made, with people that they have invited in the past. But oftentimes I do tell folks, the same energy that you're kind of putting out trying to gather these authentic storytellers or people who can come in and maybe help curate your collections, or maybe they can help you with repatriation or those kinds of things, which is to return objects to their rightful culture. But oftentimes, an institution or a body of staff may not be quite ready to engage some of those authentic knowledge holders in the most ethical way that is productive also for those knowledge holders. And a lot of times they're just really jumping in trying to engage folks, and it can be really harmful sometimes. And I think that same self-awareness that tells folks that they have some work to do, they also have some personal work to do a lot of the times, which is, we all have work to do. But I think, if your mission is to tell stories and to archive ethically, that's a really big space for improvement. I had another thing I was thinking of too with that. And then also there's, I meant to bring a couple of the books with me, but there's actually books, obviously, there's books about a lot of things. There's books about this too. And books about ethical museum practices and DEI practices in creative organizations and things like that are out there. I've read a few of them. They're fantastic, and those are also really great places to start. And then also just taking a really close look at, again, the demographics of who you already have on your staff or who's in your group. Maybe this is not a paid organization, maybe you are volunteers, or maybe this is just within your own family or your own group of friends and colleagues. But really looking at what you have already and trying to do that well, and then going out and trying to collect more, practice with your own stuff, and then maybe work with other people's stuff, because it sure is disappointing, and I've been there. I felt really disappointed in myself when I go out and I collect other stories, or I want to include other stories in what I'm doing, and if I didn't do that well, that just feels a little harder than if it's your own story.
So Lisa, when you're interviewing family members to try to get the stories, what are some of the tips? What are the questions that would open it up, particularly maybe older members of your family that may not be used to being interviewed?
Yes, it's always good when interviewing people, and I'm sure that you both had the same experience, to make them feel comfortable, to not feel pressured, or that you've got a list of 100 questions you need to get through with an 85-year-old person, to think about what maybe your priorities are for being able to get information, to gently, just as you would on a panel, right? Gently ask questions and then let them talk. Because what I've found is I have more revelations of information just when the person is really relaxed and able to have a memory. The longer that you talk to them, the more memories will come out. And it's great, and it's interesting to me, this whole notion of us recording those stories and trying to figure out then what do we do with those stories afterwards, because again, we get in this gatherer mode of wanting to get the information, have it. But then, okay, then what are we going to do with it next? We need to figure out how to put something into action or publish or share the stories in some way, and to have some time to digest the information, and also think about how that story might be told by this person in one way and might have a very different point of view from another person involved in the same situation. So, how do we digest all of that together and then do something with it? So, having a plan, again, we're all doing some version of research with this, and so having an objective, a research plan, a list of things. Again, on my handout that I've provided you, there's a link to 3 or 4 different sites if you're doing genealogy that have, a list of a variety of the kinds of questions that you can ask people. It's undoubtedly much more complex and more specific questions if you're doing research for a museum exhibition or something like that. But maybe it would give you some ideas of the kind of ways in, right? Ways into a person's memories, and then just listen afterwards.
Playing on the issue of, sometimes people well-meaning are telling stories of other people, and I think all of us from a tribal perspective have seen that. I traveled to Ohio, which was the last state that we had a reservation in before we were forcibly removed to Ohio in 1843, and they do a large pageant play of the Wyandotte removal of Ohio, and noticed, we sat down and watched it, but the gentleman playing my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had a huge handlebar mustache. Chief Tarry had never had facial hair, and how it was told, they were well-meaning, but the story was definitely not told from the native perspective. They tried to. They knew it was an unhappy removal, but those details were missing because our voice was missing. And I guess this is a question for Jensita. When you do come across someone maybe in the best interest trying to tell the story, say of boarding schools or your tribe, and it's off, how do you handle that situation?
Well, oftentimes I think it starts with the dialogue as we go there, and if we come with a very overbearing tone or overbearing nature to our questions, then of course that would make anybody right away want to be defensive of things, because again, oftentimes these people, if they aren't tribal, have put a lot of time and research into what they and did the best that they could from their own experience and their own perspective. So I think that's when education really goes a long way, and to sit down and explain again some of these differences, some of these misrepresentations within the culture. For example, in the Great Lakes area, the women there, they always own their rights to everything. Even if you were married, you weren't your husband's property. If you made cultural items, baskets, beadwork, different things, you had the right to sell those, and you could keep all of those yourself, and that was your own cultural property. And so, the women's suffrage movement and things were very odd to women in the Great Lakes to try to understand, because culturally, if you get married, that person is supposed to take care of you and supposed to look out for you, and because women are the bearers of life, and without women, we wouldn't have life as it exists in any species. But as far as that, human beings, no matter how great of a leader, no matter how great of a man, they can't create life. And that's why women in tribal cultures are elevated and seen as sacred, because of their ability to give life. And the Creator gave us that ability. No human gave women that ability across the board. And so these things were very just odd and misunderstandings, but the way that archaeologists or anthropologists that came in and studied the cultures of the Great Lakes, oftentimes when they would write in their ethnology reports, they would talk about the women that just sat there, and that the men were the leaders, that the men were the decision makers, that the men were the speakers. But what they didn't understand is oftentimes, even down to our religious practices, it was the women who made those decisions. And in our own councils, but the councils were often balanced because there was a balance. We believe in the balance of life and everything. There was men's perspectives, but equitably there was always women's perspectives because they think different. They think logically in a different way than a man. And especially very serious things like going to war and other things, women's opinions and their perspectives weighed heavily into that. So when these decisions were made in the Great Lakes area, we came from clans. And each of the clans had a different responsibility. In the Bear Clan, they were the speakers of the people. That's what their role was. They were not the decision makers. They were basically like the announcers of what the decision was going to be. But when the tribal council was called together and all the people came to be, yes, it was the leader of the Bear Clan who got up and announced to the people the decisions of these women. But that's what the anthropologist missed, was the women made that decision. And his role was simply to announce that to the people. But the way it was recorded in the ethnology reports, he was the chief. He was the decision maker. He was the leader of the people. And in fact, many of our tribes didn't have one hierarchy form of leadership. We had a council of clans, and collectively they made decisions for the people. And so when that's represented, is it that museum person's fault that the only access that they had was an ethnology report from somebody back at that time that studied our culture in the late 1800s or whatever it is that they were looking at that? No, that's not their fault. And so they're not stupid, it's just ignorant. They're just ignorant to what really happened at the time. So I see it as my responsibility to sit down and first try to explain to them the difference in the culture and why that's misrepresented, and then to pose the question of, is there something we can do going forward to provide a better form of education, and then slowly explain the importance of tribal consultants like this particular situation that would come in and be able to give you more education from within the culture to help correct some of these mistakes that were made throughout time, even though they were honest mistakes, because that's all that people from outside the culture had available to them at the time. But through education, and if we talk with them from an empathetic perspective, if it's another woman, maybe she is a mother, maybe she is a grandmother, and to talk to her from that perspective about what we want our children to be able to know in the future and how we want them to be able to respect this history, because now we all live in the same communities. It can go a long way with the way that we choose. And the way I always try to do it is to educate first and to tell them a story about something and why that is the way it is, and then kind of talk about what we could do better, we as in both of us, not just placing all the blame on the museum or the institution at the time that got it wrong. So that's usually how I try to approach things.
I appreciate that. Does anyone have any questions? We're getting, I think, within 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the session 5. Oh, we do have one.
I just wanted to ask, because looking into, history and talking to people can be so empowering, and just what maybe has been the most rewarding thing that you've learned, or maybe just a story of someone that you've spoken to that really is just like, been, wow, that is incredible, and it has been lost until now, and we've uncovered it again.
Sure, I'm not sure if you all have gotten to see, I think it was on a running loop yesterday, but there was a documentary called the Keeping Legends Alive documentary, and it talked about the history of the Haskell Stadium. And in doing some of that research, as I was reaching out to, and it was through vital statistics that we figured out who the players were, and then who their kids were, and then who their grandkids were, and if they were still alive or not. We traced them through vital statistics, oftentimes obituaries of their parents or grandparents, to figure out who we may still be able to contact today, because again, through marriage and different things, they might not have the same name anymore. And as we spoke to some of the grandchildren of some of these players from 1926, we found out that like they were just excited to find out we had collected all of this information, because a few of them kind of were the historians or were the record keepers at the time. Some of these players in the future, their wives at the time, but was their partner at the time that they were at Haskell, collected a lot of this information, a lot of these stories and things from the Associated Press at the time that followed their history of sports as it was evolving, as the game of football was evolving here in the United States, and some of those new leagues were forming. But then unfortunately, one had a major flood of their house and lost it, and the other player, one of the star players, for many, many years, they had a trunk full of this information, and as the players would travel throughout the country later in their life, they would always go through Phoenix and stop at this particular player and his wife's house to reminisce about that time, because they had all these scrapbooks and all of these things that they collected. And then unfortunately, they had a devastating house fire where they lost everything in the I believe it was 1960s. And they were, they expressed like that was their most substantial loss out of everything that they had in their home, was those records from the 1920s of that time of Haskell's history. And so they were like, their family was so excited that we had collected these things, and obviously we offered to send them digitally anything that we had, pictures or articles or stories or anything else that we collected, because we digitized everything. We're happy to share this with you. This is your family's history. This is your community's history as well. And we're just the stewards of this here at Haskell. We keep it for all of Indian country, but we're happy to share it with you. And just to see the gratitude on this family's face, because they said, you know, my grandpa always talked about this when we were young, or his face would light up when he would talk about these times. And the quarterback at that time was like one of the greatest quarterbacks in the entire nation, and he didn't get much recognition back then, but the quarterbacks on the football teams today are the highest paid member of the team today. But his grandson, he would try to tell him about this, and the grandson must have just like looked at the grandpa and not really saw him as this big football star, because he was just my grandpa, my Indian grandpa at the time. And then it wasn't until this guy named Sonny Six Killer played quarterback for the University of Washington and was the same tribe as them, that this kid like thought it was so great. And then all of a sudden he had like this epiphany, wait, what? My grandpa did like better stuff than Sonny Six Killer? And so it was so funny to see his grandma talk about that. But she said, now that we have these documents, we can show him pictures of his grandpa, we can show him the stories and things, because when we just tell the story, it probably seems like we're just kind of conflating it or whatever because it's our family, but just to see it resonate within that kid or that young man that was about to go to college, he finally got it, like how great of a star his grandpa was. And so it was just really cool to be able to give that back to these families and the communities. That was just one of my examples.
Okay, thank you so much for, I'm really enjoying hearing the both of you talk. I'll be very, very brief just in case you have more to add to the question. I think the most surprising thing that I found was I've done a lot of family histories things. I've done also public health focus groups and things. And I think my most recent project was actually during COVID, and I was looking at Black maternal pregnancy and birth narratives. And I did that in focus group style, you know, because it was time and resources and anything. And you know, things unexpected come out of stories, but things unexpected come out of spaces too. And I was really surprised, well, one, that a lot of these women didn't know each other already. And I was also surprised that almost like a support group in a way was built, and that a lot of these women ended up staying in touch and sharing you know, their birth traumas with each other, their birth successes, having their children meet each other. A lot of them had, you know, really young children. Obviously, they were part of this focus group. And the ones who were pregnant, it was really cool to get to see them have their babies and getting to go back and ask those same questions. We ended up following up about a year later. And just the things that you don't expect, because I think as a researcher, you think about the questions that you're asking, you think about the people you're interviewing, you think about the topic that you've chosen, other people's interviews that have already taken place in that topic. But there's like relationships and good things that come out of, you know, especially if you're interviewing people about something really traumatic or heartbreaking for them, and getting them to meet each other and to support each other and stay connected. That was probably the coolest thing that I've recently found in my story collections.
I think that's a great segue to mine. For me, probably the most incredible story that's happened in genealogy teaching is not my own family. It's the fact that I've made lifelong friends with a person who, through our DNA classes and the excitement that he had for finding his family, his birth family as an adoptee, discovered pretty quickly who his parents were, was able to reach out to his family, and is now connected to 400 family members across the world with this family who have accepted him in as their son and brother and cousin. And his excitement through, and you know, at age 58, finally getting to discover who his biological family was, and then the incredible energy into his life for just connecting with all of these people has been really a wonderful thing for me. So that making of friendships, again, through that process has been really good. And I think I want to kind of summarize what we've been talking about a little bit today, because there's just these themes, and we did the same thing when we had a Zoom meeting together. We saw these themes develop, which are things like teaching. You know, in a way we're all teachers, right? Because we're trying to guide people towards new information, and then there's this role of empathy, you know, the understanding of what's gone on with another person's life, respect, respecting and acknowledging another person's life story, and trust, right? A lot of this stuff will not happen unless there's some trust between the people, and again, going back to respect and so forth. So I just want to say I've gotten a lot out of these conversations too, so thank you.
Same here, and I'd say at this point, I appreciate the panelists, I appreciate you all coming. Particularly like to thank Caitlin Stanley and the Douglas County Heritage Conservation Council for having this conference and allowing this topic to be discussed. And if you have any questions after the panel, I believe most of us, if not all of us, will be available to answer any questions you might have. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.